titled Harmful Cyanobacterial Blooms in Our Waters. Today's talk will look at emerging health and water quality concerns. We'll review what causes the blooms, how to identify them, and why you should be cautious around them. We will have plenty of time, as usual, for a Q&A session at the end. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and I just ask that you try to hold your questions until the end. If you get really excited about a thought, maybe we can jump the line, but try to hold it until the end of the day or end of the session. Now, before we get started, again, I would encourage everyone to grab a cookie purchased from Feed Bakery. They're a local program that serves unemployed residents of Dane County, particularly Northsiders, by providing valuable baking training and job placements. From National Priority in Life to give us a few updates about Clean Lakes Alliance, as well as tell us a little bit more about today's speaker.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks to everyone who's joining us today at the Eastside Club. For 116 years, National Guardian Life Insurance Company has been a trusted member of the greater Madison community. It's an honor for us to invest in the crucial initiatives that help make our a better place. On behalf of everyone at NGL, thank you to the Clean Lakes Alliance and each of you here today for everything you do to ensure we have a clean, healthy water resource available. I'd like to thank our Clean Lakes 101 sponsors, presenting sponsor, National Guardian Life Insurance, hosting sponsor, the Eastside Club, supporting sponsors, Johnson Financial Group, Alliant Energy, and Perkins Coie. Production partners, the UW Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the UW Extension. And as Dana said, we're happy to have WKUW as media sponsor. A few quick updates. First, as part of the Clean Lakes Alliance's Dog Days of Summer campaign, they encourage you to send in photos of your dogs enjoying our lakes. Sorry, I'm taking pictures of that. Email photos to info@cleanlakesalliance.org. Follow us on social media, where we'll be sharing pictures of our Florida-related friends all month. As always, your support plays a direct role in protecting our lakes. With your donation, we can continue to expand our water quality, monitoring, education, and volunteer programs. Advocate for, sorry, that got off of this. To preserve the health of our Yahara lakes. And speaking of volunteerism, sign up today for Clean Lakes Alliance's Community Volunteer Days. There's one coming up this Thursday, July 24th, and another on Thursday, August 21st. We'll be removing invasive species throughout the grounds alongside our partners, Madison Parks and Holy Wisdom Monastery. Come get your hands dirty to make our lakes cleaner. More details and registration info can be found on Clean Lakes Alliance's calendar on their website. Back to today's talk. Here to discuss the role of cyanobacteria is Gina LaLiberte. Gina leads the response and communication on cyanobacterial bloom issues as the statewide harmful algal bloom coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She's a lifelong resident of the Great Lakes region, holding a BS in biology and a master's in resource ecology management from the University of Michigan. Gina has been studying algae for over 30 years. Here to share more about cyanobacterial blooms in our lakes, please join me in welcoming Gina LaLiberte.
Well, thank you everyone for coming here and joining us here today, and thanks to the Clean Lakes Alliance for the invitation to speak to you today. So I'm going to be talking about harmful cyanobacterial blooms in our waters, and I want to introduce some of the terms I'm going to be using in my talk. Okay, I'm not sure why I keep talking about. So when I talk about cyanobacteria, that's exactly the same thing as blue-green algae. Cyanobacteria is just a more scientific term for the organisms that we kind of colloquially refer to as blue-green algae, and it reflects the fact that cyanobacteria are actually true bacteria. They're just lumped in with other types of algae because they photosynthesize just the same as plants and algae do. When I talk about blooms of cyanobacteria, that's when cyanobacteria, sorry about that. So blooms are when cyanobacteria grow excessively to nuisance levels. The important thing about blooms is that there's no official quantification for defining what a bloom is. There's no actual like square footage of a bloom on a lake. There's no cell densities in the water. There's no concentrations of pigments in the water. But for the most part, blooms are things that you can see with the naked eye. And I'm going to be talking about some different types of cyanobacteria today. When I talk about planktonic cyanobacteria, those are the species. I am so sorry about this. I'm not sure what it is. See the clicker? I don't know. So planktonic cyanobacteria are those that just grow floating in the water. They don't actively swim, but they can be moved around by wind and currents. Benthic cyanobacteria are those that grow living on the bottom, and I'm going to show you some examples of those later on. So one thing I really want you to take away from this talk today is that cyanobacteria are absolutely everywhere. We're most familiar with the cyanobacteria that grow kind of in planktonic blooms, as you see on the far left. Some of these benthic species you see on the far right. But this bottom picture is cyanobacteria just growing in a mud puddle. They're very adaptable. There are actually some that grow on land, as you see in the photo on the top. So cyanobacteria are absolutely everywhere. There's no such thing as a water body that doesn't have cyanobacteria living in it. And so blooms unfortunately are not new on the Madison Lakes. They've been a problem for quite a while, and this is the earliest information that I found about blooms in Madison and Wisconsin in general. This is a paper that was published in 1889 called The Working of Madison Lakes. It has some really beautiful language that describes blooms as these greenish yellow scums that occur on Mendota and Monona during the hot weather of summer. They appear as fine granules suspended in the water, often scarcely visible to the naked eye, except as they reflect the light when they call to mind the dancing motes in a beam of sunlight. Nice way to describe a bloom. However, it goes on. Under the influence of a gentle but continuous breeze, these particles are collected into fleecy masses and driven ashore so that they accumulate along the margin of the lake, forming a slimy scum, which quickly putrefies, giving off a very disagreeable odor. So we've all seen this. This has been going on, unfortunately, for a long time in our lakes. Now, things were a bit different then. We didn't actually have sewer systems, so we had sewer septic issues coming directly into the lake. Sewage was transported directly into the lakes, so we had factories and tanneries sending their waste into the lake. So there were things feeding the blooms back then. It is different now, but we are still seeing some of these issues. So one of the big things I'm going to go over to talk about the different types of cyanobacterial blooms and how to identify. It feels like it just happened a few weeks ago, but it was probably several years ago that Diana McMahon gave one of these Lakes 101 talks at the Edgewater. And one of the things that she did was she showed different pictures of lake water, and she had the audience identify whether it contained blue-green algae or not. And something that really struck my Department of Health Service colleague and I is that people are going, oh, it's just green water. It's not a bloom. But I really want folks to understand what blooms look like, because people kind of focus on the blue algae, but it's not always the identifying factor. So back to some of those terms that I introduced. So tonic cyanobacteria are those that grow sort of free-floating. I did. Yes, little issues. And maybe it's the projector. Sorry about the technical issues. So planktonic cyanobacteria, again, these are the ones that grow free-floating in the water. And again, they're buoyant, so they float. And they float near the surface of the water, where they can sort of work just below the surface, like you see on the far left. Yeah, I can sort of see that cursor moving around. In slightly windier conditions, otherwise in calmer conditions, it sort of looks more like pea soup, as you see in these middle photos. And I also talked briefly about benthic cyanobacteria. These guys grow on the bottom, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. So with planktonic blooms, we usually think about those growing in lakes with marginal to poor water quality, poor water clarity. Benthic cyanobacteria are a little bit different in that they tend to grow in lakes that have pretty clear water. But that makes sense because these guys are photosynthetic. They're growing on the bottom. They have to live somewhere where sun's able to go penetrate through the water to reach them on the bottom. And usually we don't see them unless you're, say, snorkeling and looking at the bottom of the lake. But as benthic cyanobacteria, which usually grow in mats, are photosynthesizing, they're producing oxygen. Sometimes it will kind of bubble up in their mats, and those oxygen bubbles will lift them to the surface, as you see here. So this photo on the upper right is sort of typical of some clear lakes in northern Wisconsin. This particular species is sort of a bright blue-green color. Some of them are not quite as pretty in colors like this mat that you see on the lower right. But it's planktonic versus benthic cyanobacteria. So I'm going to focus now on planktonic blooms, and kind of the classic way planktonic blooms are often described to me when people report blooms to me at the DNR is as looking like spilled paint floating on the surface of the water, sort of pea soup, a lot of cells mixed into the water. So on the far left and in the center is sort of that spilled paint type of appearance. And you will notice that you don't see any waves or even ripples in those two photos. So since cyanobacteria are buoyant, when you've got really low or no wind at all, that's when they're most likely to float to the surface and form these scums that look like spray paint. When you have a bit more wind, that tends to mix them into the water near the surface, and that's when you get more of this pea soup type appearance for blooms. I will also point out one thing, as you will notice that you don't really see any blue in these pictures, do you? And that is because when planktonic cyanobacterial blooms are actively growing, when the cells are alive and happy and intact, they tend to be green in color, as you see on the photo on the left. And that's because they contain chlorophyll, which is the same pigment that is that plants use for photosynthesis. They contain chlorophyll too. It's a green pigment, and it tends to mask any other pigment colors that are inside the cells. When the cells in the bloom start to die off and decompose and break open, that's when the pigments in the cells are released, and that's when we start to see this blue pigment. So these sort of turquoise colors you see in the photos on the right. Chlorophyll breaks down really rapidly outside the cell, but this blue pigment persists, and that pigment is actually what gives so-called blue-green algae that name. But in general, anytime you see sort of unusually colored water that has trillions of tiny particles, you should be suspicious that that's a planktonic bloom, cyanobacteria. There are some that have sort of reddish or purple colors you see in the photos on the left. And in the center photos in the lower right, you can see sort of a gradient of different colors of green to even white. These are all blooms that are starting to decompose. You can sort of see some of these unusual colors. There's also some cyanobacteria that have more of a tan or khaki color, as you see in this bloom on the upper right. So in general, any weirdly colored water, be very suspicious that that's a cyanobacterial bloom. And back to this one on the upper right. If this is Caitlin's photo, so thank you for sharing that. I think these guys are cute. You might not like cyanobacteria, but I like some of them, and they're really cute under the microscope. They look like little koosh balls or cat toys, and Caitlin's holding a jar from Lake Mendota. So if you saw some of these sort of little brown pinhead balls in the water, that was Cleitrochia, which is a type of cyanobacterial cow. That's the one that turns the water sort of brown when you've got high concentrations of it. But you do need to be careful in looking at the tiny things in the water, because there are some things that resemble superficially cyanobacterial blooms. You might mistake them for cyanobacterial blooms if you don't look closely. So there are tiny aquatic plants that we have growing around here that very much look like blooms. So you see this sort of swirly stuff on the photo is a close-up of all that material, and a lot of the tiny plants in there are something called watermeal. It's the world's smallest flowering plant and actually grows here in Wisconsin. Superficially looks like a bloom. There are other plants, they call them lemna and duckweeds such as lemna and spirodella. They're a little bit larger, so you can see in this lower photo, the larger things are the duckweeds. All those very tiny green ovals are a watermeal, and they're really tiny, about half size of half of a sesame seed. So you do need to look closely at kind of green stuff in the water. Sometimes there's sort of yellowish stuff in the water that people often mistake for cyanobacteria, and that's usually pollen. Pollen tends to be pale yellow in color, and there's really not cyanobacterial blooms that are that color. But one of the cues is to look for that similar yellow dust on land. You can look for it on picnic tables, on cars, and if you see that yellow dust, you should be suspicious that sort of that yellow stuff that you see in the lake or even washing up on the shore of Lake Superior might be a pollen accumulation instead. And it tends to be mostly conifers, so pines, spruces, firs that produce enough pollen that you get these big accumulations in lakes. Another thing that people often mistake for cyanobacteria, especially in early spring, early summer, are filamentous green algae. And here's where the texture is really important. Filamentous green can be form these plants that you see here. They typically like water, so they're in early summer. Life cycle is that's on the surface, they're getting really stressed out. They're hot up there, they're getting too much UV light, they're stressed out, so they reach the end of their life cycle and then they start to break down and decompose, as you see in this photo on the right. And it can be really kind of unsightly and pretty stinky. I've actually gotten calls where people mistake this for a sewage spill on lakes. So this is what filamentous green algae looks like in large quantities at the end of their life cycle. So I'm going to talk briefly now about benthic cyanobacteria. Again, these are cyanobacteria that typically grow in mats on the bottom of lakes. As they're photosynthesizing, they'll lift up to the surface. And these two photos are actually from Starkweather Creek, not far from here, just above the outlet to Lake Monona. And this is sort of my weird sign of spring. I know spring is here when I see these mats lifting off the bottom of Starkweather and floating around in the creek. So they don't really look like much, just sort of darkish colored stuff. Here's a 60-pound dog for comparison, but for me it's a sign of spring around here, but I guess I'm approached that a little bit differently from people. Here are some more mats of benthic cyanobacteria, just so you know what they look like. At the bottom left are those purplish things are actually some of these benthic cyanobacterial mats that have floated to the surface. They're surrounded by green duckweeds. That's what that green stuff is. And the upper left is a close-up of those purple mats. And I think you should be able to see it in the back of the room. All those little tiny, looks like little splinters. Those are individual filaments of the species that forms these mats. Some of these are absolutely huge. You can see them with the naked eye, and that's kind of mind-blowing to think this is bacteria growing in a filament that you can see with the naked eye. On the lower right is another mat that's lifted off the bottom. It's come up with some sort of tan-colored lake sediments, but all of those little black hairy things sticking out the sides of that mat are individual filaments. And again, you can see them with the naked eye. And I also referred earlier to this these benthic mats, or this bright color, that are more typical in northern Wisconsin lakes. So these are what benthic cyanobacterial mats might look like. So when it comes to green water in the lake, you can do a jar test, just as sort of a quick check to see, if that green water is due to planktonic cyanobacteria or something else. Now, this isn't absolutely foolproof. The best way to know for sure what it is to stick it under a microscope and identify it, but kind of in general, this is a good check. So basically, put some green water in a jar, shake it up and wait, so maybe 20 minutes to half an hour. Most true algae are usually going to sink to the bottom of that jar, but basically what the jar test does is it sort of mimics those conditions where you've got no wind at all, just in a jar, and those buoyant planktonic cyanobacteria are going to float to the surface and form this floating scum that you can see. And here are some examples from around here. So on the right, you've got a really heavy accumulation that's been blown up close to shore and a really thick layer of cyanobacteria floating in that jar. On the left, you have more of a lighter surface scum, and you can just barely see the that floating layer of cyanobacteria in that jar on the left. And this is what that lighter layer looks like just through the side of the jar. I think it's really fun to look through the side. You'll see other little swimmy guys in there too, but some of these cyanobacteria have really cool shapes. The other reason it's good to look through the side of the jar is you can rule out to other floating green things like those duckweeds and watermeal. So at the top of this photo, all of those very regularly shaped green ovals are watermeal. And for the duckweeds, you can usually see roots hanging down as they're floating there on the surface. So do take a look through the side of the jar. Now, when it comes to floating gnats in the water, you can use a stick test to see if you have floating cyanobacterial gnats or something else. Basically, you take a stick, very, very scientific method, put it under the mat and lift it up. And if the stick comes out looking like it's covered with paint, like on the photo on the left, it's probably a cyanobacterial gnat. If the mat material hangs off that stick like green hair, that's probably going to be filamentous green algae. So sometimes it's really short, it's like a few inches, like in this photo in the center, but sometimes there's some filamentous green algae that get really huge, as you see in the photo on the right. And I will tell you, there is one exception that we have in the lakes around here. And that is a cyanobacterium called microcyra. So it's important to look at the color too. So you've got that hair-like stick hanging up, hair-like stuff hanging up the stick. If it's green, it's going to be filamentous green algae. But if it looks black, it's probably this cyanobacterium called microcyra. So do look carefully at the color. And it is really important to identify that because unfortunately, microcyra was probably related to the death of a dog in northern Wisconsin earlier this year. It potentially can make toxins. If you ingest them, you become sick. Now, most people are not going to want to swim or get stuff that looks like black hair from the lake in their mouth, but animals aren't so choosy. So there's some additional photos of what it looks like around here. I typically see it growing is what it looks like, masses of black hair, often tend within lake plants. And this has been around for a while. I actually looked a little bit closer at that 1889 paper, and Trelease actually mentions that. So it's been here for a long time. But again, this is one of those cyanobacteria you can see with the naked eye. This is a centimeter ruler on the top, but I mean, those filaments are several centimeters to several inches long. So absolutely huge for something that's a bacteria. And the lower right is what it looks like under the microscope. So I'm going to briefly talk about what makes cyanobacterial blooms grow and accumulate. Not just around here, but sort of statewide too. And basically it's nutrients. If you've got the nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen in the water, and you've got a lot of it, something is going to take them up and grow. It might be plants, it might be algae, it might be cyanobacteria. It's usually going to be a combination of all of those. And who comes out the winner kind of depends on a lot of things specific to a lake and sort of the sequence of events that happens in a lake when everyone's starting to grow in the spring and sort of fight for the same stuff. But in general, I went over earlier cyanobacteria in all systems, but we aren't going to see a lot of cyanobacteria forming blooms or a lot of recurring blooms or really large blooms unless we have a lot of the nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen in the water available for them to grow. Maybe not necessarily the case around here, but a lot of lakes around the state there can be issues of something called internal phosphorus loading from the sediments. So basically, if a lake's waters go anoxic, all of the oxygen is depleted at the bottom of the lake. There are some chemical changes that go on that actually release phosphorus from the sediments and make it available to grow, available for algae and plants to take up and grow. And of course, we've got sewer systems around here now, but especially in lakes in northern Wisconsin, things like leaky septic systems can be an issue as well. Especially when we have things like high water going on, it might elevate the chance of having a hydrological connection between high water levels in a lake connecting to an improperly placed septic system on the lake. So it is the nutrients. We know around here that agriculture tends to be the big source of nutrients, but urbanized systems are sources too. So anything that we can do on an individual basis is going to help the lakes. So when it comes to blooms, physical causes are really important too. I talked about wind or the lack thereof previously. So basically, when you have no wind, planktonic cyanobacteria are buoyant, that's when you're most likely to see those scums accumulating at the surface. And then if you have a gentle wind, that can move all of that cyanobacterial material to the downwind shore. So if you're going out to a lake, it's really important to look at what the forecast is. If there's been no wind at all for a few days, you might be more likely to see a scum, and you might be more likely to see a scum at the downwind shore of the lake too. And here is an example of a really highly processed satellite image of blooms in Mendota and Monona. And I can tell from these pictures that I'm just looking at Monona right now, right over here. The wind is coming from the southwest, moving towards the northwest in this photo. It's moved that bloom towards that northeast shore, which probably has that pea soup type conditions in the water. The upwind direction, you probably have clear water. And both of these photos are actually from Monona, taken about an hour apart, about 3 miles apart on the lake. So you can definitely have really patchy distribution of blooms. So it's another reason to pay attention to the weather before you go out to swim. That downwind shore, again, you're more likely to see these significant accumulations. So the upwind shore is probably going to be a lot better conditions. I personally wouldn't put my face in that picture. That's the water in the picture that's on the bottom side. And another thing to keep in mind, especially if you're in lakes in northern Wisconsin that might normally have really low nutrient levels, you can get those wind-driven accumulations in those lakes as well. I've definitely had calls from someone who's a lake, really low nutrients, they've never seen bloom issues before, and they're really freaked out because they've got like a 3-inch cyanobacterial scum at their shoreline. So I walk them through, okay, well, what's your weather been like for the last 3 days? No wind at all. And then the wind very gently blew everything that was floating on the surface to that person's shoreline. So it can happen in lakes even with the best water quality possible too, just because of those physical aspects of wind driving cyanobacteria to the downwind shore. And biological interactions are important too. Unfortunately, we are dealing with these in the Madison chain of lakes. So zebra mussels. About 20 years ago, researchers at Michigan State University did some work on inland lakes in Michigan that had low to moderate nutrient levels, and they found that zebra mussels were exacerbating cyanobacterial blooms. That's because zebra mussels are filter feeders. But they don't keep everything that they take in. They're actually able to selectively spit out cyanobacteria. And then, of course, because planktonic cyanobacteria are buoyant, they don't just sit on the bottom and die. They're buoyant, so they float to the surface and keep on growing. So the zebra mussels are inadvertently taking out cyanobacteria's competitors and spitting them out. So it's really making conditions better for blooms to grow. We've got spiny water fleas in the waters around here. With them, it's more of an indirect effect. So spiny water fleas are predators, and they eat some of the zooplankton that would normally eat some cyanobacteria and other algae. So they're inadvertently taking out the predators, the animals that would graze normally on algae. And carp can be an issue too. This photo is from an experiment in Lake Wingra a few years ago, in which this big exposure was put in the lake. all of the carp within that enclosure were taken out. And you can see the difference in water quality. Super clear, you can see the plants in the enclosure. Outside, there's a bloom. That's because carp stir up the bottom, so they make nutrients more available from the sediments up into the water, where algae can take them up. And they uproot plants too. A lot of people don't like lake plants because they can be kind of a nuisance. They get tangled in boat crops and such, but really lake plants are your friend when it comes to blooms because they are a major competitor in the lakes for the nutrients that would otherwise fertilize cyanobacterial blooms. And unfortunately, we are seeing that a lot of the aspects of climate change that we've documented already happening in Wisconsin are making blooms, the possibility of blooms really more prevalent. We are getting warmer in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region, and cyanobacteria grow better in warmer water than other types, more desirable types of algae. So warming is having an effect. We're getting extended growing seasons. Cyanobacteria we usually think about them growing now in the warmest time of the year, but they still keep going. We actually a few years ago had a bloom reported in Lake Mendota in December. They will still keep growing. So we've got a longer growing season into the winter. And then when we have years when we have a really short ice period, they really start growing earlier in the spring too. So a lot of these things can lead to earlier blooms and bloom resistance. We're seeing heavier rains and snow melt, so that means more runoff, bringing more nutrients into the lake that can help to fuel blooms. And in other lakes in Wisconsin that might be more affected by drought, things like lower water levels and warmer water also promote blooms. So I'll talk a little bit about 2024. So I get bloom reports from Wisconsin DNR. In 2024, I had 45% more bloom reports than in 2023. That's partly because people are getting more knowledgeable about blooms. They know they can report them to DNR. But I was getting a lot of reports from lakes where normally they hadn't seen them. And I think it's because of the issues that happened with the winter of 2023 to 2024. It was one of those cases where we had a really extended growing season, extremely short period of ice cover, and then we had the warmest February on record. State Climatology Office actually called it our lost winter. It was the warmest since record keeping began in 1895, and February was just sort of off the charts warm. And I can't remember what the dates were for the Mendota Ice Contest that Clean Lakes Alliance has, but it's a very, very short period of ice on the lakes, and that really helped to exacerbate blooms here and across the state. Grab some water. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the health impacts of cyanobacteria. And just really briefly about toxins and exposure routes. So cyanobacteria have been around for several billion years, and they have some really complicated biochemistry within their cells. They use that biochemistry to make a lot of compounds that we call bioactive, so the compounds that affect other living organisms. And some of those compounds are classified as toxins. The way people and animals are exposed to those toxins are by ingestion. So are you swallowing cyanobacterial cells and or their toxins in water? Now you might not, this happens a lot when you're swimming, people inadvertently swallow some water. We're not all necessarily doing like an Ironman, like this guy in the lower left photo, but it's sort of inadvertent that people swallow some water while they're swimming. Inhalation is another route. So if you are water skiing or tubing across a lake that's experiencing a bloom, that boat is kicking up a spray, and you're inhaling those water droplets as you're being pulled behind that boat. Skin exposure is another route. Anecdotally, it tends to be people who have a lot of other allergy type reactions to different substances. And we tend to see things like skin irritation or even rashes, such as in this photo on the lower right, in people that have cyanobacteria held against their skin on your clothing. So this person was launching a boat, I think, and had some shoes and socks on, cyanobacteria got under the socks and were held against her skin for a while, and she ended up with this nasty rash. But two important things about cyanobacterial toxins. So not all cyanobacteria make toxins. Sort of unfortunately for us, it tends to be those species that are more prevalent as bloom formers. But even those species don't make toxins all the time. But sort of the difficult thing about them, I guess, is that you can't tell if toxins are present just by looking at a bloom. So anytime you see a lot of cyanobacteria in the water, you do need to be a bit more wary and maybe alter your behavior a bit to be safer. And you have to recognize that exposure risk is really going to vary. If you're swimming and you're adult, you might have a better ability to keep water out of your mouth, say a toddler would, who's also touching the water and putting our hands in it. If you are doing something like canoeing or kayaking, where you're not actually immersed in the water, your risk is going to be a lot lower. But unfortunately, animals are going to be more susceptible. Animals, the dogs aren't really that picky about the water they're not used to drink. But really, the cool thing about cyanobacteria is that you can actually see those blooms that are high concern. So those present, got their opaque pea soup water. If toxins are being produced, you possibly will be exposed to high toxin concentrations if you do something like swallow that water. It might be more of a judgment call for something like these floating mats, so people can see these easily and avoid them, but if you're a dog that likes to snap at things that are floating on the surface of water, you might have a higher risk. And I'm not a lot of fun at the beach because I've actually seen the water under the microscope and everything sort of wiggling around in there. So really, water's never 100% safe. There's always going to be other bacteria, viruses, and parasites present that could make you sick if you swallow them. So really, trying not to swallow that water is the safest thing that you can do for yourself. So a lot of the things that you can do to stay safe are just sort of normal common sense precautions. If you see scones of pea soup water, avoid swimming there or boating through them, especially if you're doing like water skiing. If you as an adult can't see your feet in knee-deep water, there's a lot of stuff in the water, which may or may not be cyanobacteria, so you should choose a better place to swim. And then when it comes to kids and pets, always choose the clearest water possible for them and don't swim in those water bodies that are really shallow and warm and stagnant, because there are things other than cyanobacteria in there that might be present that can make you sick too. Shower after swimming and always avoid swallowing water, no matter how clean it looks. And that goes for especially after heavy rainstorms, which can wash things from land like goose poop into water. So we can often see high bacteria levels after heavy rainstorms. So just in general, in doubt, stay out. And then things that are really important when it comes to our pets. And a lot of these recommendations come from cases where people reported pet illnesses or even pet deaths to Wisconsin Department of Health Services. Those illnesses were potentially linked to cyanobacterial exposure. Supervise pets and keep them out of unsafe conditions, especially if you're in a lake and you know that blooms are a possibility. Don't let the dog wander around by itself and go down to the lake and drink the water. If your pets are swimming, choose the cleanest water you can and avoid those shallow, warm, stagnant water bodies. If it looks like water that people wouldn't want to swim in, dogs probably shouldn't swim in that. Always provide sources of clean drinking water for your pets and prevent them from drinking untreated water to protect against things like parasites, like Giardia, other waterborne diseases like leptospirosis and cyanotoxins. Wash dogs with clean water after they swim because they will lick their fur, and that's a potential exposure route. And if you are on a lake and you irrigate your lawn, don't use that water during blooms because you're basically bringing that bloom up onto your lawn, and if your pets eat grass, that's an exposure route for them too. So please keep your pets safe. And then I think we've got time for questions. I apologize for these pop-ups. I really have no idea what's going on, but hopefully I wasn't too distracted.
We do have about 15 minutes for questions, so if anyone does have any, I don't have a secondary mic, so we'll just kind of go around, I'll call on you. And I'll ask Gina if you wouldn't mind repeating the
Repeat the
question too.
question.
Perfect, yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the growth of cyanobacteria is controlled by nutrients, that being phosphorus or nitrogen. Is there any way to determine? I know there's a lot of concern about controlling phosphorus. Which ones are controlled more by nitrogen in the cyanobacteria?
Okay, question is about nitrogen and phosphorus and controlling the growth of cyanobacteria and really which is more important. So I'm gonna step back and go a little bit broader. In freshwater systems, it tends to be phosphorus that is what we call a limiting nutrient. It's in lower concentrations, so plants are really fighting each other and algae are fighting each other to get that phosphorus in freshwater systems. Marine systems, it tends to be nitrogen that's in scarce supply, so they're actually marine cyanobacteria that are trying to get nitrogen.
What are marine systems?
What are marine systems? So things like the ocean, there are some ocean cyanobacteria. But where nitrogen can be really important in freshwater systems is in toxin production. So some of the toxins that cyanobacteria make, they require access to a lot of nitrogen. And if you have a lot of nitrogen in that system and you've got other conditions that might lead them to start producing toxins, they've got easy access to nitrogen, so it can be easier for them to make toxins. So that's one of the reasons we are starting to be more concerned about nitrogen in systems too. Everything needs nitrogen to live, but cyanobacteria actually use nitrogen for toxin production.
Go ahead.
What are the human health effects from toxins other than rashes?
Okay, the question is about what are the human health effects of toxins other than rashes? So if you are ingesting, hope everyone's finished their cookies at this point. If you are ingesting water and you're exposed to toxins that way, it tends to be a lot of GI symptoms. So vomiting and diarrhea, kind of general malaise. If you are exposed to aerosol, so if you're inhaling water droplets containing cyanobacteria, tends to be things like more like allergy and flu type symptoms. So runny noses, I think some respiratory irritation, and if you can exposure in your eyes can kind of make your eyes red and irritated as well. There are some neurotoxins that cyanobacteria make, but usually people aren't ingesting enough cyanobacteria to have really a high dose of these neurotoxins. In those cases where they do, it's things like tingling and numbness. So our Department of Health Services has some really great fact sheets about cyanobacteria and these health effects. So I would recommend looking for the blue-green algae page at DHS. I think it's dhs.wisconsin.gov. So that's a good place to get more information about those.
What about liver toxins?
What about the liver toxins? So what I was talking about previously are what are called acute symptoms. So things that happen immediately after exposure. I think you're possibly referring to more chronic conditions from exposure to liver toxins like microcystin over time. A microcystin is considered a liver toxin and it can cause some liver damage. I think in some populations it's even been shown to increase people's risk of liver cancer, but that was in a population, one paper I know is a population in China where people were basically drinking untreated water that contains cyanobacteria and microcystin toxins. So they were getting a lot more than we would say around here with treated water systems that remove microcystin toxins. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Go ahead.
This is really for a different kind of lake, but I remember many years ago being a waterfront director on a northern lake that was surrounded by marsh and a lot and undeveloped land. And I was wondering, are those lakes now seeing these same things? Are the same algae blooms or?
Yeah, so the question is referring to undeveloped lakes with like a lot of wetlands around them in northern Wisconsin, and are these lakes starting to see blooms? In some cases they are. And it's, I mean, whether a lake's susceptible to blooms, especially something like an undeveloped lake, is very lake specific. If you have a lake that has a relatively huge watershed that is completely undeveloped, it still may be susceptible to blooms because it's still getting a lot of input from that watershed, even if there's no development within that watershed. But we are seeing more evidence of things like cyanobacterial blooms in sort of wilderness lakes. I know some people who are working on those issues in, say, Isle Royal, Voyageurs National Park. They are seeing more evidence of cyanobacterial blooms there. In some cases, like some of the lakes on Isle Royal, these blooms are growing in what are shallow lakes that are sort of normally enriched with nutrients. They're not necessarily in super deep, super cold places where cyanobacterial blooms wouldn't grow, but it really depends on the individual lake. So yeah, there are blooms happening in some lakes that we would consider undeveloped.
Go ahead.
I have a question. You had mentioned the goose problem. And I'm an East Side Club member, and I had to put up a fence down here just because we use the lawn for a lot of activities. And you know, I came down one day and there's 42 geese on the lawn, and it's a disaster. It's a complete mess. And I'm turning into Bill Murray from Canada. You know, it's turning into kind of a cycle. But I have to control this somehow. Birdie's Beach is over on the other side of the lake, and it's right by my house. Nice little neighborhood beach. Oh, a lot of kids go there. There were 38 geese there on my way here today, sitting in the sand and in 1-2 feet of water. I mean, that beach is completely unusable. So many of the parks are unusable. It's a slimy mess. And I don't have a solution to it, but I just wondered what kind of information you have about how the goose poop problem is contributing to this problem.
Yeah, so the question is about geese, and a lot of geese concentrating along the lake shore and how goose poop contributes to this issue. I would say that probably the more immediate concern is things like fecal bacteria from the geese. That goose poop, unless you're doing really going at that tidying up the lawn, it's doing pooper scooper type duties for the geese. That stuff's gonna wash into the water, unfortunately, with heavy rainfalls, and that contributes to higher E. coli levels in the water. Geese tend to be drawn to things like these beautiful lawns, unfortunately. We like them, we like to be able to see down to the water, but if we had like maybe more natural shoreline a little bit further up, it might keep them away from the immediate shoreline, just because, I mean, they don't want to be down in super high plants. They like the grass because they can see anyone who's coming and squawk at you when you get too close to them from the goslings. I don't have an easy answer, but things like making the lawns more inhospitable to geese by like increasing the height of the vegetation might be something that would help. I don't know if that means then they're gonna start moving up here and advancing on the tiki bar here or not, but it might help. I don't know. Just don't serve anything that they like, and you might be okay.
I can see them parading around right behind James Ty right now,
Yeah.
so they're ready, they're listening.
Horrible.
Other questions, go ahead.
Oh, well, just related to that, my understanding is that Madison Park sprays some kind of grape juice derived something in the parks that geese don't like, that deters them. But anyway.
Yeah, there was a comment about Madison Parks may spray some sort of grape juice derived substance in parks that deters geese. I think there are some chemical deterrents that they don't like the odor of, so they move away. There's other things that are done to manage goose populations, like oiling eggs in the nest so they don't develop. That can be kind of controversial.
Go ahead, follow up. Yes.
So, no, separate.
That's separate.
So I know this is about cyanobacteria, but I did want to ask about filamentous algae, and is that a good thing in a lake or river, or, I mean, what's the story on that?
Sure, questions about filamentous green algae, is that a good thing, lake or river? So I view it as sort of part of the continuum of what happens in lakes. We usually see more filamentous green algae earlier in the spring into early summer. That's really when it likes those growing conditions. It's got cool, clear water. That's really when it grows best. At least the lakes around here, as the water gets warmer, it doesn't grow as well, so it really, that's what causes the populations to die off. So filamentous green algae, they're not hazardous, they don't make toxins, but it is something I do caution people, like if you have these big mats of filamentous green algae that are floating at the surface or starting to decompose, that's really something you probably don't want to swim right around, because like with any other large amount of organic material in the water, it's a surface for bacteria to grow on. So when you've got these decomposing mats of algae, you can have a lot higher bacteria right in their vicinity. So when I refer to scanning the water under the microscope, there's a lot of stuff wiggling around in there. So it's really safer bacteria-wise to swim in areas away from these mats. But otherwise, they're not really hazardous. And technically, they're sort of competing with the same pool of nutrients as this and bacteria in lakes.
So I had a statement and a question. So we live on Lake Mendota near Warner Beach. So when our grandchildren come, I mean, if there's a bloom, we say don't go in the water. But you can't tell if there's E. coli and various other things. So we'll go online and we'll just check what they're seeing at Warner Beach. And that's close enough to us that it's helpful, I think, to check. The question I had is, it seems to me that, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 years ago, there was some teenagers playing around in the golf course. And apparently they went into one of the ponds. One of the boys died within 48 hours or so of fulminant liver failure. My question was whether or not, are there any antidotes to toxins that can be generated by cyanobacteria?
Okay, question was about 20 years ago, definitely from exposure to cyanobacteria at golf course pond, and whether there are antidotes to cyanobacterial toxins. As far as I know, there are not antidotes to the toxins themselves, at least when people get more typical illnesses, it tends to be supportive measures that the doctors use just to deal with things like GI symptoms and whatnot. That particular case was rather exceptional. At the time, it was the first case in which we'll call it recreational exposure to cyanobacteria was thought to be caused for the cause of that person's death. So I know that folks at the State Lab of Hygiene were working with a cyanobacterial toxicologist at Wright State University in Ohio. And the toxin researcher initially attributed this case's outcome to exposure to anatoxin A, which is it's a neurotoxin. It is a cyanotoxin that is a neurotoxin. But it was an unusual case in that the neurological symptoms, the symptoms that would normally be expected from exposure to anatoxin, which we know from different animal studies and animal exposure to anatoxin, they were not evident in this person. And there hasn't been a follow-up paper. There was a research poster presented at a conference that revisited this case. And the researcher actually went back, reanalyzed the samples, and determined that there was not anatoxin in the sample. There are other compounds that are present in aquatic systems that the way they're analyzing, they're looking at like wavelength peaks, and there are other compounds that have the same wavelength as anatoxin. So it was a very strange case in that years later, the researcher went back and said there was not antitoxin present. So we don't know what actually caused that person's death, if it wasn't antitoxin. Now, there are other cyanotoxins that could have been present, but they're extremely hard to measure, and I don't know if anyone's ever gone back and tried to look for those. So it's a really sad case, and really unusual.
Time for a last one. Go ahead.
Are you saying that the carp is contributing to the problem?
Am I saying that carp is contributing to the problem? Carp can help to add nutrients to aquatic systems. The other thing that they do is they uproot aquatic plants, and you want aquatic plants present to hold the sediments in place so they're not being mixed up into the water and adding nutrients that way, but also so you have a thriving aquatic plant community that's competing for those nutrients in the water with cyanobacteria. So healthy plant community is what you want. Carp tend to inhibit the growth of those healthy plants.
Wonderful. Gina, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
If anyone else has a question that we didn't get to or something pops up on the drive home, you can always email Clean Lakes Alliance, info@cleanlakesalliance.org. They will get your question to Gina or whoever may be able to figure out the answer. The entire presentation will also be on the YouTube channel tomorrow morning. So if you want to share this with anybody, share the information to those of you who may have houses along the lake to your neighbors, really helpful to spread that around. Quick thing, we do not have a 101 in August, but in September, we will return to discuss the connection between digesters and water quality. So that'll be fun. Don't want to miss that one. Remember to sign up for the Clean Lakes Alliance Community Volunteer Day at Holy Wisdom Monastery on Thursday, August 21st. We don't have 101, but we do have a fun volunteer day altogether. More information about that and all the other upcoming events can be found at Clean Lakes Alliance website. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming out today, guys. Enjoy the sunshine and stay cool, please, over the next few days.